But welcome and thank you very much for coming out today to our panel on the Voting Rights Act and the state of voting rights in Rhode Island and nationally at this point in time. My name is Hillary Davis and I'm the Policy Associate with the American Civil Liberties Union of Rhode Island. And what the ACLU does, for those who aren't familiar with us, we are an organization that is dedicated to upholding and protecting our civil liberties, constitutional rights, specifically relating to the first 10 amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We do that through legislation, litigation, and like we're doing tonight, through public education. And voting rights is a cornerstone of our work, upholding voting rights, ensuring equal access to voting, and ensuring that people have the right and the ability to vote if they want to. We're joined tonight by a number of advocates who've been very active in Rhode Island in terms of voting rights and other rights. To my right is Jim Vincent. He is the president of the NAACP Providence branch. The NAACP is the largest and oldest civil rights organization in the country, and they have continued to work on voting rights for a very, very long time, and have been instrumental in the original passage of the Voting Rights Act and a number of other issues since then. To his right, we have Kate Bowden, who is a staff attorney with the Rhode Island Disability Law Center. The Disability Law Center is a federally funded nonprofit law office that advocates for the rights of people with disabilities. Kate is the lead attorney for their voting access grant. The voting rights advocacy has resulted in the preservation of voting rights for 2 people with mental illness and changes to the state's voter registration form concerning mental capacity for voting. In addition, the Disability Law Center's advocacy led to regulations limiting the reasons that poll watchers are permitted to challenge voters at the polls, and improve Board of Election procedures for ensuring that accessible voting equipment for people with disabilities functions on Election Day. And last but not least, we have Leanne Byrne. She's the policy director at the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless. The Coalition for the Homeless is the leading organization addressing homeless issues in Rhode Island. And they advocate to make voting more accessible and provide technical assistance to homeless service providers to assist constituents in registering, obtaining IDs, and voting. So as you can see, we have a large range of Rhode Islanders who are represented, and we're very happy to have them all here with us. We do want to take a moment to thank the Providence Public Library for the use of their great space. This is a wonderful auditorium, and they have allowed us to do a number of events here, and we greatly appreciate it. So first and foremost, we have to talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act. As many of you know, 50 years ago, on August 6th, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, and it was a monumental act that really meant a lot to a lot of individuals nationwide and really changed the scope of voting for a number of individuals. Hoping that Jim can talk a little bit about why the Voting Rights Act was important, what it did, and how it made an immediate impact on voting rights at the time.
Well, thank you, Hillary, and I'd like to thank the ACLU and the Providence Public Library for hosting this very important topic, voting rights. This country, people have fought, bled, and died for the right to vote, and we at the NAACP feel this is one of the most important aspects of our work today, and as well as in our history. The Voting Rights Act was very important because although strides were being made previous to the Voting Rights Act of '65, notably the Civil Rights Act of '64, and even before that, going all the way back to the integration of the military in 1948 with Harry Truman, and also other things that were leading towards full equality in this country. We remember Jim Crow South when there was people that had to sit at the back of the bus, there was whites-only bathrooms, whites-only water coolers, whatever. Social equality is very important, but without the right to vote, African Americans or any American really could not participate in American democracy. So that, in a nutshell, became very, very important to many, many people, not just the people that are part of the NAACP, but many, many groups that were very involved in the movement. But before the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the vast majority of African Americans could not vote in this country. The vast majority, and the numbers could be as low as 25%. You cannot have American citizens that are being denied the right to vote with barriers like poll taxes and literacy tests. I mean, if that's not un-American, I don't know what is, but yet that was what was happening in the Jim Crow South on a daily basis. So with Martin Luther King and people from the NAACP, NAACP, the Urban League, and all the different organizations fought so long and so hard to have that process of blatant discrimination reversed. It was really something to behold and something to be celebrated. So today, we see that the Voting Rights Act has been under attack. I can't help but think we're trying to roll back history. I mean, the people that fought, bled, and died, their legacy is being tarnished each and every day. When we look at people for a very partisan reason trying to roll back something that should be fundamental in terms of American rights. So I don't want to go on and on about it. I think people that are here understand the importance of it. But the NAACP has pledged to work very firmly when it comes to the Voting Rights Act. Only police community relations and maybe education would be other things that we would be focusing on this year or in the near future. So we're here to stay, and we hope to have good discussions this afternoon.
So it's important to note that voting rights was something that a lot of people felt like the black community, the minority community already had. Isn't that right? Prior to the Voting Rights Act, they really felt like, well, poll taxes aren't a problem. They're not actually targeted at people of color or anything like that. We already have a constitutional amendment that says you can't be denied a vote.
Yeah, people have been in denial since the beginning of time. I mean, people, you had one test. I remember John Lewis saying one time, there'd be a jar of jelly beans, and you have to predict or guess how many jelly beans in a jar. What does that have to do with democracy? What does that have to do with voting? I mean, these things were absurd on its face. Clearly, they were designed to disenfranchise a whole group of people. Those things that were done then, if anybody accepted those things, then, God bless them. I just don't know how anybody that's fair, that's reasonable, could not have seen that these things were targeting a whole group of people so that they wouldn't be able to participate in our democracy. So, no, I think people, that felt that everybody had the right to vote, probably living in a cave somewhere.
So there are a number of important provisions that were in the Voting Rights Act, but two that were of extreme importance to the black community, to the minority community, were the law prohibited state and local governments from passing laws that made it more difficult or allowed people to be denied the right to vote based on their race. And there was also a section of the Voting Rights Act that said if you were a region that was known to engage in discriminatory laws like this that had this racial impact, that you had to get prior approval before you could enact these kinds of laws. As a result, according to the New York Times, in 1956, only about a quarter of eligible black voters in the United States were registered. By 1968, that had increased across the South alone to 62%. So there was an immediate and marked increase in the ability of black voters to vote. But the Voting Rights Act didn't only apply to black voters. It didn't only apply to minority voters. And there were a number of implications for all individuals as well. And I'm hoping that Kate and Leanne can talk a little bit about how it affected particularly individuals in your populations.
One aspect of the Voting Rights Act that not many people know about is that it provided the right to assistance in the voting process. So for people who were illiterate or people who could not read or need some form of assistance or have a disability, the law requires that they be allowed to have an assistant for the voting process. So that would be to mark the ballot. And that provision of the Voting Rights Act is codified in Rhode Island state law as well. So if a person needs an assistant because they are shaky on their hands and they're not able to mark a ballot, or because they can't read, they are allowed to bring the person of their choice into the voting, into vote. And there are limited restrictions on that. You're not allowed to bring someone from your employer, an agent of your employer, or someone from your union. So that aspect of the Voting Rights Act has an impact on the people that I work with, and it's a little known part of the Voting Rights Act.
Thanks, Larry.
I think the biggest piece that I speak of most often related to people experiencing homelessness and their ability to vote is that in the daily life of people who are not housed, it's a life of invisibility. That's something that we hear most of all from our constituents, that the greatest loss they have is not necessarily of their apartment or the stability that goes along with having housing, but that people treat them like less than a person. And for for us, we see the Voting Rights Act as an opportunity to address barriers that our population may face as low-income people, as people of color, as people representing every group in our state and in our country. And it's a way to address the barriers that those folks face when they vote, because in their daily life, people experiencing homelessness face a lot of barriers to get basically anything and everything done. And to have an opportunity to address those specific to where they vote and how they vote and their access to voting is a major impetus to making sure that they're participating and using their voice and being able to participate fully in their democracy.
So for about 47, 48 years, the Voting Rights Act did pretty well, keeping people protected and ensuring that everybody had the right to vote. And then a few years ago, challenges started to erupt in various states to specific provisions of the Voting Rights Act. From 2011 to 2012, 27 measures were passed or implemented in 19 states that made it harder to vote. Rhode Island is not exempt from that count, unfortunately, as we will talk in a minute. And then a couple of years ago, a year ago, there was a Supreme Court decision that essentially eliminated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. If Jim wants to talk specifically about what that was.
Well, Section 5 is pre-clearance, I guess, one of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act.
Louder, please.
Section 5, I'm sorry about that. Section 5, thank you. Section 5 is the pre-clearance provision, and part of the Voting Rights Act of 65 stipulated that those states that had proven records of discrimination had to go through a pre-clearance process in order for them to receive certain changes to their voting procedures in their states. So when that was struck down, I think overnight, a number of states sought to restrict the vote, sought to restrict democracy, saw it as a way of holding down people's access to the ballot. And I have my own feelings about why that is. I mean, the country has been diversifying for a while now. And I think that diversity was punctuated with a big exclamation point with the election of President Barack Obama. And of course, the Supreme Court, I guess, has gotten a little more conservative over the years. So you had this perfect storm of events that I think led 3 years ago to states holding restrictions. I think there were 7 states that had voting restrictions in place before the president was elected, and then it went to 25 shortly thereafter. So I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's a reaction to the fact that you have a diversifying country, you have people that feel that they're threatened and anxious and whatever, and they will do whatever they need to do to kind of make sure that things stay the same, or there's a status quo, or there's this fear, there's this anxiety. So I think that, when the pre-clearance was struck down, because Justice Roberts said, well, the country has changed, my response to him is that the country hasn't changed enough. Yes, it's changed, but it hasn't changed enough for those states to have that ability to just do whatever they want to do after their long history of discrimination.
So when Jim mentions that a couple of states overnight began new restrictions, it, I believe, was actually within a number of hours after the Supreme Court's decision. There were new voter ID laws that had been held off because they hadn't been pre-cleared that were suddenly in effect, and there have been restrictions that have popped up in the meantime. It's my understanding that there certainly is a bipartisan group in Congress that's interested in taking care of some of those provisions of the Voting Rights Act, but in the meantime, there are a number of states, again, including Rhode Island, that are finding new and really wonderful ways to restrict voting rights for all individuals, and we're going to get to talk about those in just a moment. But I did want to talk about, very briefly, the state of voting rights sort of nationally at this moment, including one way in which Rhode Island has succeeded in ways that others haven't, and that's in regard to felon disenfranchisement. So one of the really big ways that the vote can be restricted is that states have laws that say if you are a felon, you lose the right to vote. And as we all know, people who've been paying attention in Rhode Island and nationally, felonies are not always they're not for violent crimes, they're not for heinous crimes, and regardless, these are individuals who will return to the community and need the ability to be represented. It was in fact just a few years ago that Rhode Island decided to give back the right to vote to individuals who were convicted of a felony. In Rhode Island, once you've completed your felony sentence, you get the right to vote back. Why this is important is when we look at the makeup of our prisons, we see whose rights are being restricted. It is very often people of color who are saddled with felonies and in other states lose that right permanently. And as a result, our legislation becomes less representative. Rhode Island, following it should be noted, a huge outpouring of support from the community and from the citizens decided that we could do better and we gave back the right to vote. Many other states don't have that, and that is a big issue elsewhere. Voter ID, as we'll talk about in a moment, is becoming and continues to be a very large issue, particularly for the minority community, but also for low-income, disabled individuals, elderly individuals, and students. It was, in fact, voter ID laws that were implemented almost immediately after the Voting Rights Act was struck down. However, there is a tiny sliver of hope. I think it was just last week that Texas's voter ID law was struck down, at least temporarily, because of the Voting Rights Act. So there are still these challenges that exist. There have also been eliminations of same-day registration, which, as you know, we don't even have. There have been restrictions on mail balloting and various other difficulties that have been put in place that make it more difficult for people to get to the polls. But at this point, we want to talk about what has become sort of a hot-button voting issue here in Rhode Island, and that is the issue of voter ID. Jim, you want to talk a little bit about voter ID and how it happens? Because I think a lot of people would like the answer to that question.
Well, you know, unlike most laws that get passed in Rhode Island, I think this law happened by a couple of anecdotal situations. I've never in my life seen a situation where a couple of people had something happen to them, and the next thing you know, lawmakers are rushing to pass a law. I think a Loyola study that I read recently, I think they looked at 1 billion, maybe 3 billion votes cast. There were only 30 confirmed voter fraud cases. 30 out of 3 billion, I think it was a 10-year study, it was a Loyola study, I'm quite sure. The time with 1 billion and 3 billion, there was 30 confirmed cases. So certainly there was no evidence in terms of confirmed cases of fraud here in Rhode Island to pass anything, let alone a law that would further restrict voting rights. So I don't know. We're in a different state than let's say some other states, so I'm not sure what the motivation was to do that, because certainly, there was no evidence of widespread fraud. In fact, the fraud that, where there was evidence was in the mail ballots, which ironically would have made easier to obtain. So the left hand clearly didn't know what the right hand was doing, and now we're left to pick the pieces. People of color, the elderly, students, everybody knows they don't have those photo IDs in the same proportion of other voters. So for those people that know that, it was easy to kind of put that law in place and restrict voting rights for those populations. I'm not saying here in Rhode Island anybody sat in a room and thought this would be a way to restrict those groups, but I don't think there was a lot of thought that went into why we should have it in the first place. Usually you need some hardcore evidence, you need all kinds of hearings, proof, whatever, to pass any law in any state. This is the first time I ever saw something that was passed strictly based on anecdotal evidence through a state legislature. I was in amazement by it. And I think the rest of the country was in amazement by it too, for partisan reasons. Nobody thought that a democratic state would actually limit the voting rights of people that are constituent, that have constituencies in the Democratic Party. Yet Rhode Island has managed to do that. I'm not a partisan. NAACP is non-partisan, looking at it strictly in terms of the populations that are being disenfranchised, the homeless, the elderly, people of color. To say that they're not being affected at all, I think is Pollyannish. I think that no matter what provisional ballots or whatever, there is an effect to it. There's a chilling effect if nothing else, and people don't know exactly whether they can vote or not. So that's why we fought so hard against it in the first place.
So for all three of the panelists up here, how are the groups that you represent affected by voter ID at this point? What have you seen? What do you know? What have you heard?
For people with disabilities, we were concerned that this would be another hurdle for someone who may not have transportation to be able to get the underlying documents in order to go and apply for an ID. It seemed to be making things harder. We've been surprised by the different people who have been impacted. We assumed that we would see more people in the homelessness community, and sometimes we're hearing that they needed an ID to get into a shelter. So I'm sure that we'll hear more about that. But we did see a number of people in the community of people who are former substance abuse users or who are in the recovery community, and this group seems to be, when I go out and I'm in the field offering voter registration or pairing with the Secretary of State's office and offering voter ID, this is where we're seeing a lot of folks who need the ID. So it's definitely impacting people with disabilities.
I would agree with what Kate said, and for our population, obtaining an ID is important to many of the services and activities that they need to do anyway. But it's one that comes at a major expense to a lot of our case managers and the agencies that serve people experiencing homelessness. And when we think about it solely in the process of voting, despite the availability of the free IDs from the Secretary of State's office, because people need an ID for other reasons, it doesn't make sense for them to go and get a photo ID that they can use for nothing else, that it only is available for voting. So the preference is towards a regular ID, and obtaining that obviously costs money. To us, it's an equivalent of a modern-day poll tax to have that requirement. The other thing that I would say is that poll worker training is a bit spotty on this issue, and we've heard several concerns about people who present IDs and their addresses don't match. We have a highly mobile population, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about electronic voter registration, but our constituents almost never have an address that matches where they're currently staying or living or where they may be voting. And Rhode Island law allows people to vote from wherever they live. So if you live under a bridge and that's your address, you can be a constituent of that district. It's not a valid address to put on any form of ID and wouldn't match what someone might put on their voter registration forms to where they receive mail.
So does the law itself actually say that your address has to match?
It does not. That's not a requirement at all.
And so what you're seeing is that poll workers are denying a ballot based on information that's in fact not incorrect, not wrong under the law.
And the other thing is that there's a perceived concern among our constituents about being challenged and the possibility of walking in and having someone tell them that they can't after they've made the effort of going and waiting in line.
So a couple of the ways that Rhode Island's law is heralded as sort of a model law in other states is we have two provisions that a number of other states don't. The first is the free IDs, which you heard about, which are provided from the Secretary of State's office. And the other is the ability to cast a provisional ballot. Is there anybody who's comfortable explaining what a provisional ballot is?
So the Help America Vote Act came to pass after the 2000 election with lots of irregularities. And so the Help America Vote Act provides that if a person goes up to vote and the poll workers say you're not registered, but the person is certain that they're registered, they have a right to vote what's called a provisional ballot. So that means that you get to mark your ballot, but it gets put aside to later determine whether or not you were in fact an eligible voter. So when we look at our voter ID law, the voter ID law says that if a person appears at the polls and asks to vote but does not have an ID, they are allowed to vote a provisional ballot. The provisional ballot will then be checked by the local municipality against the person's registration form. And if the signature on the ballot and the signature on the registration form appear to match, the ballot is supposed to be counted. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Okay, I got a couple of things there. One, my signature doesn't match 2 years ago, let alone 20, because of the little arthritis in my hand. And so I think that, you know, it really depends on who's really matching up the signatures. And two, nothing is free. Somebody's paying for it. That's you and I. There are so many problems in Rhode Island, so when they say free ID, somebody's paying for that, the taxpayer. I'd rather see that money go to much better uses than to give somebody an ID that's been voting for 50 years just because they are not, having in their possession a photo ID. So, to me, the cost that the state bears because they have to produce it, that cost to me is offensive. And the fact that, you have a person that is trying to match up signatures that may not match because I registered to vote 20 years ago and my signature doesn't even match 2 years ago. I think that's a problem too.
It's definitely subjective.
Very
so
subjective.
It could be city to city as to what's happening with the provisional ballots.
Unacceptable.
Now, when the voter ID law first went into effect, it was in fact a non-photo ID law. It has only been within this last election cycle that it has become a photo ID law. Can you explain why that difference matters?
One of the forms of ID that was acceptable before were people's bus passes, or several of our shelters administer IDs for people to check in and out. Those were sorts of identification that our constituents had already, or a piece of mail from a government agency for our folks that receive public assistance of some sort. Those were things that they had already. But the photo ID is, as I mentioned already, a more expensive and less accessible form of identification.
So the voter ID law, they phased in several stages. So originally there were some non-photo IDs that were allowed that included a birth certificate or a social security card. And now we're in the most restrictive phase, which is photo only, and there are only 7 forms of ID that are supposed to be accepted.
Well, if you have to get a birth certificate or whatever, that costs money, so I can't help but think about poll taxes all over again. I mean, what are we talking about here? So, obviously I'm not in favor of it. It's photo IDs, I think it's restrictive, and I think it just, it hurts in terms of getting as many people voting as possible. This is a democracy. We want to increase voter participation, not do anything to tamp that down.
Many of the other organizations, along with the ACLU, regularly engage in poll monitoring during the elections, and in fact there is a sign-up sheet in the back of the room if you are interested in serving as a poll monitor for the upcoming 2016 elections. And so we've seen firsthand some really real impact of the voter ID law. The biggest impact of a voter ID law cannot be measured, and that's the people who don't show up to the polls at all, either because they are concerned that they don't have identification, or because they're concerned, as Leanne has mentioned, their ID will be questioned in ways, and it is questioned in specific ways. And so that concern can never really be quantified. We have seen a number of real impacts, individuals who've been turned away at the polls for various reasons. And one of the biggest problems ends up actually being around these provisional ballots. Because poll workers don't know when they're supposed to give a provisional ballot, why they're supposed to give a provisional ballot, or what they're supposed to do with it. And so our poll monitors have witnessed individuals who have had so many questions asked or have just been told they're not eligible for a provisional ballot and who have walked away from the polls. And that's very distressing to us. That is the very real impact of voter ID. A couple of years ago, the ACLU testified before the House Government Oversight Committee in regard to our concerns, and we testified that our poll monitors witnessed individuals who, like Leanne mentioned, were told their ID, their address didn't match, which again is not part of the law, who were told they could not get a provisional ballot for whatever reason, which was incorrect, and people who walked away and did not come back. And that is very, very concerning to us. And so if anybody is interested in assisting with poll monitoring in the 2016 elections, it will be very important. Last year, or last election, when photo only went into effect, it was an off-year election. It was really a small election. We are very concerned with the impact of a voter ID law on a presidential election, and what happens when a number of people show up and don't have access to these IDs. For those people who have said it's not a problem, everybody has an ID, I don't understand, you can't buy X, Y, and Z without an identification. The Secretary of State's office, at our last count, had given out something like 900 of these free voter IDs. So individuals clearly did not have identification. These individuals have been fortunate enough to get to the Secretary of State's office or to be in the area when the Secretary of State's mobile unit comes by to get these identifications. We remain concerned with those individuals who never were able to do so. Is there anything else in terms of the real impact of voter ID at this point that anybody would like to add before we move on?
Well, the naysayers will say, well, you know, in certain states they have these voter restrictions. There was actually voter turnout had increased. They look at the presidential elections, for example, but they don't want to admit the fact that having President Barack Obama on the ballot, that plus the fact that people who feel that their vote is being taken away from them sometimes react angrily and will wait in lines for hours because they feel that you try to take away my vote and then you have a chance to vote for the first African-American president. That's why the turnout was high, even though voting restrictions were put in place in those elections. So you kind of look at it fairly, at least when you make the argument. And I just feel that people need to understand why you have 7 states in the country before Barack Obama was elected, and now you have 25 states that have voter restrictions. If anybody feels that that's a coincidence, then that's fine. But you know, I ask you to look again. Something really is happening, and it's not good in terms of our democracy.
Just as a reminder, we believe there were 0 prosecutions for voter impersonation fraud in Rhode Island prior to the passage of the voter ID law. Given what our poll monitors have witnessed in terms of people being turned away as a result of voter ID, we have felt fairly secure in saying that more people have had difficulty vote than have had their vote taken by somebody who didn't or who was impersonating them in the polls. But beyond voter ID, there are some less known, less talked about, more complicated voting issues that Rhode Island faces, and one that the ACLU talks about a lot that impacts a number of individuals is something that's called prison-based gerrymandering. And you're going to have to bear with me for a second because this gets a little complicated, but it has to do with representation and the way that the voting lines are drawn. So everybody is pretty much aware the census worker comes through every 10 years and they count how many people live in your house and live in your neighborhood, and they draw a voting district based on that number of individuals. They draw federal districts, they draw state house districts, state senate districts, they draw city council districts. It goes all the way down.
They is not the census question.
Sorry, the census information is used to have these districts drawn. It's actually drawn through a massive redistricting process that is public and takes forever, and there's a lot of yelling involved. But the census data is what is used. The concern for us is that individuals who are at the ACI, if they are there for pretrial detention, that is, they have not yet gone to trial, they are there serving a weekend sentence, maybe a misdemeanor, they are there serving a year, or they are there serving 10 plus years. Every individual who is at the ACI on the day that the census worker comes through is counted as if they all live at the exact same residence on Howard Avenue in Cranston. They are not counted for voting purposes as if they live at their home address. Rhode Island state law says they have to vote from their home address. They do not give up that address for voting purposes by law. As a reminder, under Rhode Island state law, if you are incarcerated on a misdemeanor, you haven't gone to trial, you still have the right to vote. If you are incarcerated on a felony, you lose that right until you have completed your sentence. But when you get out and you go home, you still have that right to vote.
Hillary, can I just jump in there one
Yeah.
second? It's, as long as you're incarcerated on a felony conviction, you lose the right to vote. The minute you are released, when you walk out the door, you get the right to vote back. So you could still be serving your sentence on probation, but because you're released from the Department of Corrections, that triggers back the right to vote.
Thank you. Important clarification.
A little bit of a distinction.
Really important clarification when you keep in mind how long our probation periods are in Rhode Island. But the ultimate point is that the district that is around the ACI, it's actually 2 or 3 districts at this point, are drawn artificially large. They are drawn as if something like 3,000 people live there who don't. The districts from where all these individuals hail, all their home districts, are then artificially smaller. So if you live in a high crime district There are a number of your neighbors who have ended up at the ACI in the last 10 years. You have less voting power. You have less representation in the General Assembly, in your slightly less of an issue at the federal level than the people of Cranston do. One district in Cranston is something like 20% prisoners. Those are individuals who don't live there, likely don't live there, cannot vote there, will not be able to vote there when they leave. So it becomes an issue of voting power, how much your vote means once you get to various levels. Does everybody understand the idea? It's a little bit of a thing to bite off. So how does that affect the individuals that we're talking about? How does that affect the populations, that we're representing? Anybody want to start in on that?
Well, obviously, the ACI here in Rhode Island, 50% of the people that are in the ACI are people of color. Our state population of color is 25%, so there's a disparity right there in terms of all those different districts that, not in every single case they live in the same areas, but by and large, you have certain areas that are disproportionately affected because of the fact that that's where they are coming from. So in all of those areas, they're voting less voting strength than other districts, and it's supposed to be all equal. So yes, of course it's affecting those communities.
Well, this is connected but not exactly related to prison gerrymandering, but I would just also like to note that that same district that is represented by all the folks that live on Howard Avenue in Providence is also right next door to the largest homeless shelter for men, Harrington Hall, which is an 88-bed facility. And we know from the data that we collect from people when they do their intakes that people experiencing homelessness literally come from every single city and town in Rhode Island. And so they are also counted. Obviously, it's a smaller number. That's, like I said, an 88-bed facility, but sometimes hold up to 100 men a night. But another way that those districts are inflated.
So why is representation important? Why does it matter? Anyone like that one?
It directly affects who you can send to the General Assembly. I mean, it's as basic as that. If you have a diminished voting strength, that's not good for your population. So, I mean, you just can't have it.
There are some solutions to prison-based gerrymandering. The one is there's been a bill that has been in for many, many, many years at this point and has actually passed the Senate twice in the last 2 years. And what that bill says is count those individuals at the ACI as if they live at their last address. It's very simple. It's very constitutional. It's done in other areas. And it would be a very easy solution to this prison-based gerrymandering issue. It has unfortunately not moved in the House as of yet. So we hope to see that move forward. There is also, it should be noted, an ACLU lawsuit in the city of Cranston, because of course it is Cranston that is directly affected by this. Because the city council districts are drawn, again, disproportionately large. And we will have to see how that plays out. We would certainly hope that the legislature would get involved before there would need to be any sort of lawsuit at the state level. Moving on to something a little less complicated is electronic voter registration. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Electronic voter registration is the idea that business happens online more and more, and there are a number of states now that have implemented online voter registration. So that would mean that a person could update their voter registration or register for the first time from a computer. There was legislation that was introduced in Rhode Island to bring electronic voter registration here. It passed the House and was scheduled to be heard by the Senate, and there was no vote and the session ended. So we do not have online voter registration in Rhode Island as of yet. The good news about online voter registration is that in the states where it's happening, states seem to be saying that it makes voting easier, makes the process easier, and is cost saving, surprisingly. The bad news is that a study was done actually by the National ACLU on the accessibility of these online voter registration programs, and many of them were not accessible for people with disabilities, especially visual disabilities. So the legislation that was introduced in Rhode Island did have some language which would require any online voter registration program to be compliant with the ADA and web accessibility guidelines.
I would add that I think that the majority of states, I think, in the country now have that. So it's not a couple of states, we're not the first state to think about this. If I'm not mistaken, the majority of states in the country do this. So let's get on, let's get the program in there.
The Pew said, I think it's at about 20 now. So it's getting, it's
20 states, so
it's getting there.
We should be one of them, absolutely.
I would just say that, again, for a highly mobile population like people experiencing homelessness, having an easier and more accessible way to update a voter registration form would be an important improvement for our constituents and case managers that are trying to assist.
So what is the difference between then our current registration process and the electronic voter registration process?
So what happens now is you have to get your hands on a form that you fill out. The National Voter Registration Act required many agencies in the state to assist with that. The DMV is supposed to provide voter registration, and agencies that work with people with disabilities are required to do so as well. So you have to fill in the form, you have to mail it in to the local board. They process it, they give the information to the Secretary of State's office, and it's a paper system. So it requires you to put on the stamp and get it in the mail or show up somewhere.
Okay. We talked very briefly, we mentioned at least very briefly, mail ballots. And I think mail ballots are something that are probably going to be the subject of a lot of conversation moving forward. Leanne, you want to talk about how mail ballots work in Rhode Island and what the deal is right now?
Sure. So for several years, access to mail ballots was restricted to certain situations. If you were out of state because of work, or you had a medical restriction that would keep you from voting on election day, you could apply for a mail ballot and it was sent to you and you could vote ahead of the election. When voter ID passed, there was an expansion of accessing mail ballots. It was expanded to what we call a no excuse mail ballot, that you could just say that you weren't going to be able to come and not give a definitive reason, and then you would be able to apply for and receive a mail ballot. The other important thing to know is that there's an emergency mail ballot period. So if you've missed the deadline to get a regular mail ballot and have it mailed to you in time to mail back before the end of the day on election day, you can also go to your local board of canvassers for a certain period ahead of the election and vote in person on a mail ballot. In the 2014 election, as in elections before, there were several concerns about the handling of mail ballots and the possibility that people were being coerced or ballots were being altered after they were filled out by the voter. One specific instance directly impacted our constituents, people who are living in the towers of Crossroads on Broad Street, and the possibility that some volunteers with the CNC campaign had tampered with their ballots or pressured them to fill them in a certain way while they were there. Legislation was introduced this year by the Secretary of State's office around who could handle a ballot after it was completed, trying to cut out the campaign worker or volunteer from ever handling a ballot after it was completed. While we appreciate that effort, and we know that part of the impetus was a concern for our constituents and the integrity of their votes, we were concerned that often in a group living situation like a shelter, outgoing mail is handled by a staff person, that there's an outbox for people's documentation, and that our own case managers would be put in violation. And often in situations where someone isn't living with a direct family member, which was who was restricted in the handling of the mail ballot, that those voters would not be able to complete and submit their ballots as easily as they could.
Anybody else want to talk about?
I'd just like to say that the NAACP Promise Branch supports the efforts by the Secretary of State in terms of how she's trying to reform the mail ballot process here in Rhode Island. We totally support our Secretary of State.
I'll just add a little bit about the mail ballot process for the people that I work for. So if you are a person who is in a facility like a nursing home or assisted living, or if you find yourself at Butler Hospital or Eleanor Slater Hospital and you want to vote, the mail ballot process is a little bit different. In that case, you request a mail ballot because you are confined to a facility, and instead of having it mailed to you, a team from a bipartisan pair from the Board of Elections goes to the facility and brings the ballot to you. So what we've seen with that kind of mail ballot process is that it can be difficult during the emergency mail ballot period. If something happens and you find yourself in a hospital and you want to vote, you have to get the application for a mail ballot, the original application for a mail ballot, to the municipality before they'll send anyone out to you. So that can make the process a bit burdensome for those voters in facilities, unexpectedly in facilities around election time, who want to vote.
As we talk about, or there is a conversation about mail ballot reform, is there anything that is particularly concerning to you that you would want to make sure was dealt with, either preserving some ability or something that's lacking at this point in time?
I think I would just echo what Leanne said. We want to make sure people vote. We want to make sure that the process is fair and accurate and secure. So as we look at security, I think we should be careful, very careful about the limitations we put on who can deliver a mail ballot. Many people that I've worked with do not have family who could do that for them, but their CNA would. So we need to be mindful of those communities and who they might have available to assist them.
I would just say that while we were discussing this legislation at the State House this year, we reached out to several colleagues in other states and colleagues nationally, and there's definitely model language that tries to be more restrictive about using mail ballots and includes a caregiver option. That's something that we suggested as an amendment and would be highly supportive.
No, it's just that, nobody wants to see a system abused, so any reforms is going to make sure that there's confidence in the system. We're in favor of something like that.
Switching from mail ballots to the reason many people would like to get mail ballots sometimes, we really do need to acknowledge the very, very, very long lines that happen at a lot of the polls, and the issue that has happened recently in Rhode Island with broken voting machines. Why is this an issue for voting for all, any of the individuals on stage?
Well, long lines. I mean, long lines. Who wants to wait in a long line, for anything today? All right. So obviously, there's going to be people frustrated, people that intend to vote and that are not going to vote just simply because the process is not running efficiently or smoothly. So that's bad. And broken machines, that could happen, but if it's happening just in a certain area or a certain population, there's a disproportionate amount of machines being broken in, then that's a cause of concern. So, I'm glad that they're monitoring that and that they're looking at that, because we got to make sure that everybody can vote, that is registered to vote, and we don't need any of these problems of long lines and broken machines. I mean, it's hard enough to get voter turnout at a level where we all can be proud of.
The Disability Law Center on election days has a voting rights hotline, and we always receive several phone calls from people with disabilities or people who are elderly who are worried about what they're going to do if there's a long line and how they're going to handle that. So it's definitely an issue we hear about.
Is there anything what do you generally tell them in that circumstance?
There is state law that allows a person with a disability or an elderly person to go to the head of the line to check in, or they can ask as an accommodation to have a chair to sit to accommodate their needs. So that's what we tell them.
One other thing to note is that very often election day, well, in Rhode Island anyway, election day the schools tend to be closed. So when you have people voting in these long lines, you not only have the adults who are trying to vote, but you have them taking around their kids who are exhausted, hungry, tired, don't want to be there. And many individuals, there's a period of time that you're allowed to get off your job, but a few years ago in the 2012 election, some of those very long lines exceeded 2.5 hours in Rhode Island, especially once the machines started to break. And there were a number of individuals who did leave the lines because they had to go back to work. We hope that they came back, but we're not sure. The issue of broken machines, old machines, is something that Rhode Island is talking a lot about right now. Kate, are you familiar enough with the new machine process?
Well, I can tell you that I've been monitoring the process. The Board of Elections had convened a task force to look at the process of acquiring new equipment. And then very recently, legislation was passed which allows the Secretary of State's office to have the sole authority to procure equipment. So there is now a task force with the Secretary of State's office that's been convened, and the meetings have just started very recently. They've been on Thursday afternoons. There's one this week. A number of community members have been invited to sit on the task force, and they are looking at what the minimum requirements would be for an RFP for new equipment for Rhode Island. And they're looking at ballot counting machines as well as the required accessible equipment that would allow people to mark a ballot privately and independently.
Anybody else?
I'm just happy that the Secretary of State is really reaching out to vast constituencies. She's really trying to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table in terms of this particular issue. So I applaud her efforts to really have a lot of people that are concerned about this issue in the room in terms of the machines.
And one final thing that's always on the ACLU's radar that maybe isn't always on everybody else's radar that affects elections is something called the Administrative Procedures Act. The Administrative Procedures Act is the rulemaking process for the state entities. It talks about how you can promulgate rules and regulations, and specifically it talks about having public input into various rules and regulations processes. A little known fact, in Rhode Island, the Board of Elections is exempt from the Administrative Procedures Act. They are not required to go through the same rules and regulations processes that almost every other state agency is. That is deeply concerning to the ACLU because it takes away your ability as citizens, as interested parties, to talk to the Board of Elections about how you want elections to run, what you want to have happen. There has been a provision of a very long-standing sort of election omnibus bill that has been in for many years to place the Board of Elections back under the Administrative Procedures Act. It was also its own standalone bill this year that was moving until the sort of quick end of the legislative session. And so we hope that relatively soon there will be a slightly more open rulemaking process in regard to elections. I doubt anybody else is going to want to weigh in on that one. Okay. So I wanted to give a few minutes to the panel to talk about, just openly about what they feel are some of the major other issues or other issues that we've talked about, election issues that are facing Rhode Island, what is happening now that we need to be paying attention to, and what we need to do moving forward to make things better. Just going to open that up to you guys.
I would say a major barrier for our constituents is the lack of a real in-person early voting process. For our constituents, their day-to-day life is full of appointments and reliance on public transportation, and just like many of us have plenty of places to be on election day, opening that calendar up to having other opportunities for in-person early voting would help us as a provider community or organize more ways to get people to the polls, but also make it easier for our constituents.
I'm still concerned about the photo ID, that latest provision of the photo, because I saw national studies that up to 25% of people of color didn't have a photo ID. You know, we're living in a country where you don't really have to have a photo ID. So up to 25%, so if you apply that to Rhode Island, I don't know how many that would be, but I know that the 900 or whatever they did is just a fraction of that number. So I'm thinking that there's still a lot of people out there that, for one reason or another, still don't have a legitimate photo ID, and you know, if they do vote, are subject to provisional ballots, which I think the process is well-intentioned, is still flawed for a number of reasons, and so you still have people not voting. And for my constituency, who had fought, bled, and died for the right to vote, not the privilege, like some things that you need a photo for, like cashing a check at a liquor store, or maybe taking a Parisian vacation, privileges that you need a photo ID for, not the right. The right, voting's a right, apples and oranges, rights and privileges are different. I still worry about that one or two people that should have voted, could have voted, but didn't vote because of this barrier.
I think with the Disability Law Center, the grant that I work with, the goal is to ensure electoral participation for people with disabilities. So we support any sort of provision that makes voting easier.
So if there is something that the people in this room can do in the next year to make voting easier, what is it for all three of you?
Well, you know, without sounding trite, I would repeal the voter ID law. That's what I would do if I could just wave a magic wand and do something that would make some of this stuff better. But I would also implement all the reforms that the Secretary of State has at the table. I know that there were, I think, four parts of her voting act, and if all those things were passed, I think we'd be a long way in the right direction.
From our perspective, we just want to make sure that any changes are compliant with the ADA so that the people with disabilities have the full access that they are required to have under the law.
Ditto.
She keeps it short and sweet. I'm not going to keep it quite so short and sweet. We have a number of things that you can do over the next year that can really make sure that we not only preserve but also expand important voting rights. On the table in the back of the room, there are, as I mentioned before, there is a sign-up sheet to become a poll monitor. That is something that's going to be very important to us in the 2016 election. You can be a poll monitor in a short shift. It could be a couple of hours. It can be in your neighborhood. And we will, of course, fully give you all the information you need about what to look for. But we're very concerned not only with the impact of voter ID and provisional ballots, but all these other unintended issues that come up. The long lines is one, the broken machines. We always need eyes to make sure that the process is going exactly the way it should. While the 2016 elections sound like they're very far away, they are very much not. So if it sounds like something you're interested in, please go ahead and sign up, and we will contact you back when we are ready to get started on that process. There are also two Know Your Rights. Well, one's a brochure and one's a palm card on the back table. One talks specifically about voter ID, and the other one talks about your election rights generally, talking about your registration rights, your in-person voting rights, your mail ballot rights, all of that. Please take, please share, and please let us know if you need more. As a heads up, the election is a little bit away, so there is plenty of time for those laws to change. Please check our website for any new updates. But those are important to pass around, particularly to affect the communities like the ones we've been talking about today. The other big thing is to talk to your legislators now. It was a couple of years ago that there was a very strong push for voter ID repeal in Rhode Island. Voters were very upset, and they made that anger clear. And there was a productive conversation for quite a while about, at the very least, freezing or taking voter ID back to the non-photo stage, which, as we talked about earlier, meant that people who didn't have photo IDs could still vote because they would have access to things like their utility bills and the kind of things that people are more likely to have. Those constituent conversations are very important, and those are things that you can do today, tomorrow, over the next few days that can really shape the conversation moving forward. And of course, talking about any of the other issues that we have talked about today, please sign up for e-alerts. We'll keep you posted on all the other things that are coming up, and I'm sure everybody else has their websites as well, to keep yourselves notified as to what is going on.